My name is Mariano. I come from Argentina. I'm a porteña who left Buenos Aires and went to live by the sea, especially because I like peace. That's strange in a developer. But I'm going to speak not so much in processing payments from the point of view of codes, but everything that you should not do when we are processing payments, especially in Latin America. It would be very easy to sit here and to see codes as to how to integrate Stripe, but we're not going to discuss that. I'm going to speak of all the problems that we have when processing payments in Latin America. And this is an experience that I come working in kind of that is a remote place for working in Latin America. That means that you have to handle many languages, many time zones, many currencies, many processors. So part of this experience is what I wanted to tell you now. And the crazy thing is that actually it's the most important thing of every startup. I am not aware of any startups working with no money. So processing money becomes the most important thing in a startup. And the crazy thing is that despite the fact that it's the most important thing, yet most people, knowingly or not, decide not to import money and not to worry too much about the way they process payment. And that is rather bad from the point of view of the lifetime of a startup. If you can't process payments, and if 60% of the people that come to buy things to your site cannot pay, obviously you have no future. And when I say that they are choosing something, and awareingly or not, that they're saying that they don't care about money, because in most startups they are offering things to pay online and they make it complicated. And from all points of view, especially when you pay in a form. This is not a form, although I drew it. It reflects a lot a form that I found in an online site in Argentina, where I was asked for the street and the door number of my address. At the time, I found it. I was living elsewhere, and I found it very difficult to put an address. So you are making it difficult for people to pay. And another experience is I was with a supplier. I was trying to pay. I was denied. My card was rejected. And they said, well, we use Stripe as a provider. But I said, well, if you're using Stripe as a supplier, you are rejecting the payment, at least in Argentina or in Brazil, of many transactions. You're losing a lot of transactions because I don't know whether you know it, but in Brazil and in Argentina, there are rules, there are restrictive rules, complicated rules for purchasing dollars. And when you're using a national card in an international payment processor, you are really working with dollars. So if I have a site that is for the Latin American market and I'm using an international payment provider, you are telling people that you can't pay. So I'm leaving out a market, $12.2 billion market in Brazil, so it's not wise. Many of these suppliers or startups don't give me enough choices. Certainly, if I tell most startups, if we ask them, when you have to monetize the site, how are you going to do it? Well, we're going to choose a supplier and then a credit card. Well, and what if somebody wants to pay with money orders with one of those companies? For instance, here in Uruguay, there are companies that where you just go to the store and pay. But if you limit so much, you are rejecting many people. And in other places in the rest of Latin America, there are other things than credit cards. Last year, I went to Africa, and I saw that even in the most remote places, there was a logo that was M-Pesa. And I asked what it was. Even in the small stores, it was called M-Pesa. It occurs that in Tanzania and in Kenya, for many years, the people worked with SMS. An African could send money through an SMS to another person, and went to those places in M-Pesa and received the money. So that became a way for paying. So many businesses would accept Emesa. You can pay with an SMS even at a restaurant. So imagine all the potential outside a credit card. Not only do many startups give me any options, but most of them don't know what to do with failed programs. I live in Miramar and I go to work in Buenos Aires, so I travel a lot by bus. And when you travel several times a month by bus, it's rather tedious to go to the bus terminal to purchase the ticket. There are several providers that sell them online in Argentina. So they say, well, a user can register only once with an Argentine ID. Or you can only create an account if you have an ID. Once you created one, you can't create any more. When I go and pay the first ticket by the supplier, they reject. When I try to pay, they tell me that the credit card was not accepted, so they closed my account. So I sent an email and I said, well, I'm trying to buy a bus ticket and they closed my account, and it is because I was using an international card, and for some reason they were using a provider in Argentina that wouldn't accept international credit cards. So I don't know. Apparently, it's not good to bring dollars away from abroad. So I couldn't register with a new ID. So immediately, I was cast away of that supplier because they assumed that I was trying to embezzle them. They said, well, among the 45 million Argentines, it's impossible to have one that has an international card. It's obvious that that's a fraud. So they lost me as a client. So most of them are doing things very difficult to pay. And this is something that needs to be stopped. If we are going to start developing a startup with the idea that we are going to do it whatever we can not to be paid, well, devote your time to some other things. But if not, you have to worry not of the API you're going to use or how you're going to model a table or whatever. But the first thing is how to make things easier for those who want to pay it. What are the markets I want to work and what is it that I want to reject? I loved a phrase. One of the days we were in the first days of Workana, it was Sunday morning, 3 a.m., 4 p.m. So somebody went to Workana for 8,800. And they said, well, somebody is Sunday morning putting money in your side. You have to be crazy. No, well, you have to be crazy to put money everywhere. In Argentina, we have the expression that is having a crocodile in your pocket. In a startup, I have to think that there's a crocodile putting money in in the pocket if you want to put money in a startup. If I'm making it difficult to pay things, it's like putting a crocodile in the pocket. So how can we face a solution? What I'm going to say is crazy. You have to build your own API. But how? If there are gateways, if there are processors, there are many, many solutions. Actually, when I speak of your own API, I mean mentioning all the elements that have to do with payment processing, particularly payment processing with a service that has a lot to do with what I just said, where really that service of payment processing is working with the gateways, with the payment processors. That's why I say gateways and not gateway. I have to be analyzing fraud. Then I'm going to show why it's so important to consider fraud. And obviously, my payment service needs to receive the calls from my front end and my administration back end, and I have to be producing a lot of reports. We're going to see each very quickly. Now, when I said gateways with an S in plural, it's because one gateway doesn't exist. There are no companies that can promise that they have a one single solution for payment for everywhere in the world. And it's impossible, because from Workana we worked with many payment processes, because each country is different. There are countries where the credit card is much more frequent than in others. In other countries, for instance, they use more the banks, so it's more common to pay through the banks than through the credit card in Brazil, for instance. So we're all different. So even where there's a long list of payment processors, there's nobody that can solve this in a comprehensive way, in an integrated way. And I put a question mark there because I'm attacking the slogan of a new company that is called Get Mango. Very interesting name. Mango in Spanish is like a dollar. And so they promised to do this with one single app, but I don't think that they will achieve that. So many of the suppliers here have to do with Latin America, with international payment. These are well known in Latin America. AstroPay and PayU are not, or Dinero Mail. Dinero Mail is now PayU. And Stripe, well, the Stripe is the preferred by the developers, but please consider the local processors. But as I said earlier, not just do you have to accept payments through cards, but bank transfers, online, or cash. If I can accept cash in my portal, why can't we do it? If you start dividing the transactions in your site, you're going to realize that actually you have income coming from a range of sources. For instance, this is a payment screen in Workana, for instance, for Argentina, specifically for Argentina, because we're all different. So the payment screen is very different for the guy who's buying in Brazil or in Colombia or in Argentina. The options are different. The order of the factors is also different, and it's even influenced by what is more effective for each country, not just because he's a provider, but a supplier, but for usability. Obviously, when we are working of different markets too, I don't fully understand the number of startups in Latin America that use dollar as currency. Wonderful. Everybody understands about dollars, but in Brazil, they speak of reales, and here Uruguayan pesos. In Argentina, we dream of dollars because you can't rely on the Argentine pesos. But in more serious countries, people use local currency. So if they do, why do I need to force the people to understand something in a currency that they don't usually use? So I should be able to work with a local currency, so that broadens when I process payment, it's not just accepting a credit card, it's much more than that. And when I said that the order of the lamp lights alters the lighting, then if you start analyzing how people buy in your site and what are the payment choices they use, maybe you discover that what you thought that was the most effective payment for the country, then you discover that it's another one. Maybe you realize that when you put cash before PayPal, then you duplicate what you're selling. So you have to measure. Unless you measure, you won't realize, especially in the new startups, that may make the difference between life and death, being able to survive or to go out of business. So I need to be able to measure everything in the payment process. If I know that somebody is buying, how long did it take from the moment he decided to buy something, how many screens, how many forms he had to fill, how many clicks, and based on that, how the conversion fall, and based on that, to do re-engineering and to change it constantly. So particularly the payment screens change sometimes because we add new suppliers, because we are in a region where the rules are very volatile, and so the suppliers that are here today may not be here tomorrow, and sometimes because we decide to based on what we see the people do. Now, when we are deciding to keep the data of the credit card, we need to respect the PCI standards. This so that the credit card company may accept it. If your startup has the opportunity of meeting those standards, it's very convenient for you to keep the credit card for many reasons, and this has to do with the failed payments. When I have a failed payment with a credit card, in most cases, in most startups, as they use only one processor, they say, well, this credit card was not accepted, so you can't pay, so I'm sorry. But we find that sometimes certain credit cards are not accepted with the supplier, but they're accepted by others. So it's stupid to be throwing the problem to the customer, the problem of a payment processor that for some reason rejected the credit card. But I could try with different gateways. So maybe it was not accepted by PayPal, but it was accepted by Stripe. So for the customer, that was a successful payment. We had to go through different suppliers. Now it continues to fail. Imagine that you went through the several suppliers, and even like that, we couldn't accept the card. Most startups say your payment was not accepted, and they will never again get in touch with you. They lost a client. But rule number one, and this is something that I learned that goes against what we as developers understand that common life is. We understand that common life doesn't go through a telephone, but you have to call people. We discovered that when the payment process fails through all the attempts, it was very good to take the phone and to call the client. But that's crazy because many startups don't believe in telephones. There's a payment processor, the largest in Latin America. I won't say the name, but they have no telephone numbers. Nowhere do you find a telephone to get in touch with them to say that you want to pay and they're not allowing you. It's incredible to see how many people want to pay and they can't because they can't get in touch with you. And sometimes when you call, maybe the problem was that he had a problem and entered the numbers the wrong way, and put the wrong key and put the ID number where it shouldn't. So maybe you could have recovered that patient, that client. Now, when you call, sometimes that's a funny experience. And this is something that I learned. I had no experience until I got to Workana, that is learning about fraud. First of all, having attempts of fraud in your startup means that you are succeeding. One of the founders of Workana that had a social network, he had a wonderful idea of competing against Facebook. He did fairly well until Facebook got to Latin America. And he said, well, in the first days of Workana, they said, we haven't seen fraud, so we don't know whether we succeed. So when somebody wants to do something with your site, until you have a fraud, you can't consider that you have succeeded. Now, be careful when you have a fraud. And by fraud, I mean numbers of credit cards that don't belong to the people. Maybe they found it on the street and they want to use it for buying things. Or in the case of Workana, they may even draw money. In the marketplace, I can send a payment to somebody. So it's much more attractive for the people interested in frauds because I can use a credit card to draw money from a credit card that doesn't belong to the person. Now, and this has to do with calls. Sometimes part of the fraud, at the beginning, the fraud attempts that we detected was through the phone. A couple of days ago, I told someone at a meeting here in Uruguay the first case of fraud that we had was very funny. It was a weekend. We saw that someone was hiring a lot of people for different amounts, $1,000 or $1,500. And then we saw that the person was using different credit cards for all payments. And so we said, here, there's something that's not working. So we called the person and we said, please show us that you are the true owner of the credit card. Because I don't know whether you know that there are many payment processors that we saw that in all the cards you put the name and last name, and though he had many credit cards, and we called and we said, we need you to show that you have your credit card and your ID and to get a picture so that we can have a credit card. So the person showed his face and document and the credit card. So we said, well, it's a real person. And at that time, I was at the office and I was to use a fraud processing system. And I said, let me run this transaction through this fraud system. It gives you a number from 1 to 100 to see the potential of fraud. And it was 99.7. So he said, something is happening here. So it showed us, this guy showed us the information, and we Googled a company, we Googled an article in Dominican Republic where the person was being taken to prison after fraud with certain credit cards, and he had been released from prison and he was again trying fraud. So that had been 6 or 7 months ago, but he would draw the ID card. And so now, to process or to prevent the fraud, we have several alternatives. So, and if you process payment, you're going to have to do this, because not only is it important precisely to benefit the person who has stolen the credit card, but with any payment processor that you use, if somebody asks for a refund in a payment, the payment processor will start alerting your startup. So depending on the people that are asking for a refund on your side, when you go past a certain percentage, the payment processors may say, well, this startup is not good because it's generating many actions. So you have many companies, MaxMind, Sabuno, or Fitside. You give them the card number, part of the card number, the email and the e-pay, and they say from 1 to 100 how many chances it has to be a fraud. Now, if someone gives you 98, well, 98 would be a fraud, but not necessarily should you abort the attempt, because there are situations such as when I wanted to buy the bus ticket, because for some reason they said that it's a high number because it's an Argentine that's using an international card, but it's a real purchase. What you need to do there is to stop and talk to the customer and see whether it's really a fraud. Let me try to go a little faster. This is the last slide. And when I say fraud, not only is it with a credit card, but an internal fraud. In the marketplace, it's easier to detect an internal fraud because you have more information. If in Wakana I have someone that's issuing a payment from one person to the other, they both register at the same time, it's more likely for it to be a fraud. So. And the two things, I start reporting, and I have a much more clever system for detecting fraud that is not taken into account. Well, I did it quickly. I know that you're all hungry. But in 7 days, there's an expiration of the call for papers for a conference in 7th, 8th of November. Maybe I'm going to receive, it's a multi-language conference. We are going to have a it's a PHP conference. If you want to talk about anything, please send your talks before it's due.